Welcome to The Dirt on the Past, a program of the Extreme History Project that explores the good, the bad, and the ugly about our human past. Because, let's face it, Crystal.
Yep, history is not pretty, but it is so important to know.
Because it is the very thing that has led us to the most critical concerns that we have in the present. So join me, Nancy Mahoney.
And me, Crystal Alegria.
As we talk to archaeologists and historians who have been digging in the dirt.
And in the archives.
To uncover the fascinating histories that are not only relevant to today's issues.
But help us move forward in a better way with a deeper understanding of our past.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the show. I'm Nancy.
And I'm Crystal.
And we are the co-hosts of The Dirt on the Past. This week, we are at the KGLT studio speaking via Zoom with Peter Brown about his job at the Montana State Historic Preservation Office. So we're excited to talk with Peter. But first, Crystal, what's been going on in your probably last couple of weeks? It's been a little bit since we've done a podcast.
Yeah, we've had a few weeks between podcasts here. And I guess the biggest thing, which you and I were just talking about off air, is that I went to the Emmy Awards.
That's just amazing.
Which was so much fun. Much fun. So the documentary that we've talked about on this podcast before that Extreme History was involved in, The Story of Us, The Women Who Shaped Montana, was nominated for an Emmy. And so
great.
Kimberly Hoegberg and myself, Kimberly was the filmmaker. And so we went to Seattle for the Emmy Awards, and that is the Northwestern Region Emmy Awards.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a huge honor. That's amazing.
It was so much fun. We had such a good time. We did not bring home an Emmy. We did not win the Emmy in our category.
Did the Emmys for those look like all the other Emmys?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
They are huge.
You got to get one next time.
I know.
Because that's just, you got to have one.
I really wanted one.
Where's that table full of Emmys in the back? I know.
I wanted, after seeing them, I'm like, oh, I really do want one of those. I didn't think that before I went, but yeah, it was great, and we were just so excited to be nominated for an Emmy and to be in that room with all those amazing people. So it was a great event. We didn't bring home the Emmy, but it was still, like I said, wonderful to be nominated and to be recognized at that level. So
yeah, that's wonderful news.
Yeah. So that was the big thing that I did the last couple of weeks. What about you, Nancy?
Well, I went off to South Africa for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So we all flew over, the whole family, to see my husband's family over there. And it was a different time of year for us to be there. So May is kind of getting into their kind of fall winter period.
Okay.
But it's not really cold. I mean, we still swam over there and stuff. And there were still awesome, like, baby warthog, baby giraffe, baby zebra on the farm. It was really pretty fun to see all of that. And I was able to hike and test out the new hip and get some miles under my belt. And that
you have your new hip.
I know. So that was fantastic.
Good.
So we had a lot of great time with Ian's folks, and it was beautiful. And my kids were just having fun eating all of Grandma's delicious cooking. And
nice.
I know. So it was just wonderful. And it's been interesting because South Africa's been dealing with their whole system for energy has been they haven't been keeping up with it and funding it the way they should, that infrastructure. So there's a lot of load shedding, they call it, which means periodically certain areas have to shut down the whole system for a while. So every once in a while during the day, like, okay, you all of a sudden can't buy something at a shop unless they have a backup generator or something like that. But Ian's family's farm, all of their houses on there are on, in the lodges that they lease out, they're all on solar now, which is great.
Wonderful.
Although, on a cloudy day, you can't run the dryer, but the rest of the time, everything's amazing. So yeah,
Wow.
I know, but it's just was beautiful and lovely to be back and that. So then I was extremely well fed and well rested
good.
getting back here. And now the rush of the tourists is back,
Yes.
which is exciting. Yeah. And we're ready for it down at the shops. And we had our first art walk last Friday. So I know, it's exciting.
Yeah, summer season is here. Our walking tours are going strong, and
awesome.
It's so much fun to be downtown in downtown Bozeman during the summer.
It really is.
It's busy, but it's got a lot of energy.
People are excited to visit.
Yeah.
And before my niece left, who had been house sitting for us while we were in South Africa. She stayed for a while longer, and she is actually my niece from Ian's brother from South Africa. She's been in America, and we took her to Yellowstone for the first time with her friend, and we got one of those magical days where it only rained while we were driving from one point to the other, and then it was just beautiful, and
Oh,
we
nice.
saw a mother grizzly bear with two cubs,
Wow.
and then two black bears, and then we got a baby bison with bison and a bunch of elk. So
Oh, you had a
we
good
got the animals
Yellowstone
in,
day.
I know,
Yeah.
and then the just everywhere else was beautiful. So they had such a good time. So yeah, I kind of feel like my summer has started now.
Yeah, I know. It's in
Yeah.
full swing. Yeah. Well, we should probably get back to our guest.
Yes, we should.
So, Peter, I'm so glad you're here today. But before, I guess we have one more piece of business to do before we get to you, and that is the sponsorship for this episode. So, we want to thank the Montana State Historic Preservation Office for sponsoring this episode of The Dirt on the Past. The Montana SHPO works together with all Montanans to promote the preservation of our state's historic and cultural places, from archaeological sites all the way to homestead farms. The Montana SHPO is responsible for protecting Montana's historic places and paleontological resources under the Montana Antiquity Act, and assisting federal agencies when assessing the impact their actions will have on historic places under the National Historic Preservation Act. We are so grateful for all that the SHPO does to protect and preserve our state's cultural heritage.
So Pete, we're super happy to have you with us today. Welcome.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to start off by telling our listeners a little bit about you. Peter Brown
Okay.
has been Montana's State Historic Preservation Officer since 2019. His work at the State Historic Preservation Office, or the SHPO, began in 2002 when he served as the Historic Architecture Specialist. Pete has written countless architectural reviews and has authored the current State Historic Preservation Plan. He has also produced a documentary on Montana modernist architect Daphne Bugby Jones and collaborated on the Montana Historical Society's Montana Modern exhibit. He has a particular interest in locally sourced qualities of Montana's historic built environment, really focusing on the native woods, stone, and clay that were used to construct many of the historic places that we inhabit and treasure. So I'm getting a sense that your draw into this field was through architecture rather than archaeology itself.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to hear a little bit about that. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and so I'll just continue on with that question, Pete, and just say, how did you come to have an interest in cultural heritage and history and the field of historic preservation?
Yeah, I guess I've always been drawn to historic places from the time I was little. And I remember when my family lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan, I just loved riding my bike around our neighborhood and looking at the houses. It was so architecturally diverse. You had things from the early 1900s up till the mid-century. And I guess I've always had an eye for that. But didn't even know there was this thing called historic preservation until kind of the 90s. And after college, I wanted to do something interesting before settling down. So I signed up for the AmeriCorps program. I was in Philadelphia at this point. And AmeriCorps was partnering with the North Philadelphia Habitat for Humanity. And so what they would do is acquire abandoned row houses from the city for essentially free. And they're all brick row houses with stone foundations. And they were all abandoned, had been for a long time. So roofs were failed, a lot of rot inside. And so we would go in and stabilize them and make them habitable again. And they were Habitat for Humanity houses.
Wow.
And, I had been doing that I did it 2 years in a row. And it wasn't till late in that I found out there's this thing called historic preservation. and that I had been doing it for a while
Little
and
did
had
you
had this
know.
interest my whole life. So after that, I pursued a master's degree in historic preservation, and there are a handful of universities around the country that offer that. And I went to Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, David Letterman's alma mater.
Oh, goodness.
Um, so I happened to have met my wife in that historic preservation program, and we ended up in Boston prior to coming to Montana, but we feel like we won the lottery and we moved to Montana. We both got jobs in our chosen field of historic preservation, which is crazy to
Yeah.
think about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. That obviously worked out well for you. And to stop off in Boston is so amazing too with all the historic structures there. That's got to be pretty incredible. I was
Yep.
just visiting recently. So, Pete, can you tell us a little bit about or tell us in general, let's start with that, what your main responsibility is as the Montana State Historic Preservation or officer, and then tell
Mhm.
us a little bit about what you actually do on a daily basis. And I hope it's not going to be like writing reports in a windowless room. So let's
Oh,
let's
I'll
see.
leave out the part about reports. But really, what I do is plan for our office activities. And when I say plan, I'm talking about plan in the broadest sense. And so um, we operate on a 5-year preservation plan, and it's something that's based on a lot of outreach and public input. And based on that, we identify goals and objectives that our office adopts, and we encourage other sectors of preservation to adopt them too. So Preserve Montana, the statewide nonprofit, pursues some of the same things we do. But I get that plan together, and we work on implementing it here, and we have different people with different expertise here and different responsibilities, and we um, just all kind of grab on to those goals and objectives and figure out how we're going to meet them.
So
So
let
part
me
of that is simply doing our jobs, which is kind of reviewing and commenting on projects under the National Historic Preservation Act or the State Antiquities Act.
I just
Yeah.
want to ask for a second when you're talking about you're based in Helena because you're
Mm-hmm.
an arm really of the state government. And when you're saying coming up with the goals, you're talking about the whole state of Montana, which is
Mm-hmm.
massive. So can you just give us a little bit of an idea of what is that like to try to get information on this state, which is very different in the western side than it is in the eastern side? Do you go out to different places? Do you have officers stationed in different places? What does that look like to get that information back in to
Yeah.
be able to write a plan?
Well, we it used to be actually a lot harder than it has been, because it used to be we'd have to do public meetings um, in as many places as we could, and we were having people fill out paper surveys that we would
Oh,
then have
wow.
to bring back and tally, or they would mail them to us. And now, of course, there's this thing called Survey Monkey, which we're all familiar with, and we still do the public meetings, but chances are a lot of people who'd like to contribute aren't going to be able to get to one of those. And so, in addition to public appearances across the state, we rely on the some communities have local preservation offices that are part of the local city or county government. So we rely on them to kind of broadcast these surveys and seek input from people in their areas. Social media is incredibly effective in just reaching people all over, and even going beyond kind of Montana's borders to reach people who may spend several months of the year here and have input. Um, so we're able to reach probably more people and tally things better than we could in the old days when it was all on paper. But we got 570 responses to our survey, and we kind of had that open for about 6 months. And then we did more directed interviews with people, and we invited, I think, probably 40 people to participate in interviews, and we were ultimately able to get 22 of those. Not everyone was interested or willing, I guess, but we got 22 pretty solid hour-long interviews with preservation stakeholders who had real specific ideas. And so we get all this, and we kind of processed it, discussed it as an office, and came up with our goals and objectives. So
Nice.
that those are basically my marching orders and our office's marching orders for addressing these things. Like, one that comes up routinely is there's not enough money for preservation, for brick and mortar projects, to pay for community surveys to document historic buildings or landscapes in communities. I mean, there's never any money for anything. Preservation is no different.
Low man on the totem pole.
I was just going to
that's
say,
terrible.
though,
Yeah.
yeah, historic preservation's always way down there.
Yeah. So that's kind of a call to us to pursue grants, to go beyond kind of just our basic mandated tasks, and kind of expand on what we do with the aid of grants. There, I think it's another one that's pretty common is expand the audience of Montanans who are engaged in preservation, who are aware of preservation and why it's important. And so that's not that's all versions of diversity. It's rural, it's age diversity, it's racial, all that, everything. We if I consider preservation events I've been at, it's a lot of white college educated people from Missoula, Bozeman, Billings, Helena, Butte, Great Falls. And so there's so much to Montana that doesn't fit that description. And so that's, again, one of our priorities. Go beyond the sort of converted, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know, Pete, that you and I had a conversation, it's probably been a year ago, probably as part of that kind of creating that plan. And so maybe I was one of those stakeholders that you called and talked to.
I think so, yeah.
I think so. I just kind of remembered that. But I want to dial down a little deeper and talk. You mentioned the National Historic Preservation Act. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that within what you do at the Historic Preservation Office here in Helena.
Yeah. So the National Historic Preservation Act went into effect in 1966, and it establishes a framework for preservation. And it brought about a couple pretty important things. One, it is that it established the National Register program. And the National Register is kind of, we call it an honor roll of historically significant places in America. And that, it could be archaeological sites, it could be historic buildings, it could be a structure. Like we recently had MDT nominated a bunch of airway beacons. That's a structure. It's not a building.
Oh, yeah,
no one occupies
yeah.
it. It's on the landscape, and they nominated a bunch of those
Yeah.
across the state. So it's not the obvious one like the Daily Mansion. It's the humble log cabin somewhere too can be listed in the register.
Yeah. You just nominated a mausoleum in the Billings Cemetery, right?
Right.
Yeah. I thought that was a neat one that just went on the register here. So
yeah, it's not one that people think about as the typical National Register property.
Right.
Are things like trails, like the Lewis and Clark Trail, things like that are visible, are those able to be nominated?
Yeah. And so the exact route of Lewis and Clark, some of it's defined, some of it's not real defined, but there's Travelers Rest, which we know
campsite.
They spent time at. There's Great Falls Portage site, and so Travelers Rest is actually a National Historic Landmark. And that is actually a program that predates the National Register. And it was for those really like high flying historic sites like, Mount Vernon, I guess, or Independence
Yeah.
Hall in Philadelphia.
Okay.
Um, but National Register kind of is more inclusive, I guess, than the National Historic Landmark Program.
Okay.
So,
So,
and it was, okay, so the National Historic Preservation Act brought that about, but it also brought about a sort of regulatory side to preservation. Um, and it came in response to what we call the federal bulldozer, the kind of federal highways projects that were just leveling neighborhoods, um, or just these large scale federal projects that were impacting all kinds of
like
ancient
like
sites or
dams that
historic.
would flood whole valleys and whole sites would be lost under the dams too. I think that
Yeah,
was also something that was very disconcerting to people to lose all those structures. Yeah.
right. And so the National Historic Preservation Act, but with its regulatory aspect, is the federal government putting some kind of checks and balances on what its agencies are doing with federal money or what they're permitting. And so it extends only to projects where the property is either federally owned, and so that could be Forest Service land, it could be a historic inn in Glacier National Park, or it can be any project that the federal government is funding. So that could be a highway project or a HUD project. They're going to re-roof a historic age house, and so we review that. And then there's the federal permits. Like, so Northwestern Energy gets a permit from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. That's a federal permit. So we review things that Northwestern Energy is doing at their historic hydroelectric sites. One thing, the National Historic Preservation Act and the National Register Program do not place limits on what private property owners can do with their private money and their private property. An exception to that is if local governments have decided that they want to have a design review. Typically, they will apply those design review requirements to National Register listed properties. And there are a few communities in Montana that have local design review, but that's not our office. So we don't get involved in what Joe Blow is going to do with his house, unless he's getting some kind of federal money for it, which is
right.
rare.
Right, right. So that kind of goes back to a conversation we had on the podcast a few podcasts ago with Sarah Rosenberg, who is our local Bozeman historic preservation planner and officer. And so we talked a lot about how, as a private landowner and a private house owner or residence owner, you can kind of do what you want to do within the city code and within the city guidelines. And so that kind of extends out to private property outside of towns as well. But if the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, or the Forest Service owns a piece of property, then that's when the National Historic Preservation Act comes into play.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yep.
So, Pete, you talked a little bit about how the SHPO office engages with local communities, particularly in cities, Missoula, Bozeman, Billings, places we've spent a lot of time, Butte, where, there's a lot of historic architecture, there's downtown spaces, and folks in those cities are very interested in efforts to preserve a lot of their historic architecture. And then sometimes there are those city codes that have already kicked in and zones. But you were mentioning, Montana is a big, primarily rural state. So what are the ways in which your office tries to kind of take an exciting, enticing message of a historic preservation efforts and kind of raise awareness for all the other smaller and rural communities, which often have amazing places as people were coming out and settling? This is one of those, I feel like, the last filled in regions actually in the U.S. And so there's a lot of battlefields, but homesteads, all kinds of interesting places. But what's some of the ways in which the SHPO works to to try to get people in other areas involved and excited?
Yeah. Well, we try our best to latch on to existing programs like MSU Extension has their Reimagine Rural program. We always take a role in the Montana History Conference, or the Montana Historical Society's History Conference, I should say.
Yeah.
And then Preserve Montana puts on what they call a road show every year, and they pick a different place for that. We sponsor that, and we host components of it.
Is it like the Antiques Roadshow? What is that?
Yeah, I guess it kind of is, but it's there's no appraising things, but it's looking at local historic places in different communities that have hosted it.
Do you have
and
a
so
bus?
it's, like I said, it's in a different place every year they do it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you guys, the last one was was it in White Sulphur Springs, or was that a time or two ago?
Yeah, it was a time or two ago.
Okay.
And then they didn't have it, of course, during COVID. They had a
Yeah.
virtual one.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then this past year they have a leadership transition thing happening, so they
Right.
didn't do it. But we're anticipating they will do something in summer 2024.
Oh, good. Good. So it
Um,
kind of focuses on a specific region of Montana, and you kind of have an in-depth look at the history and the historic preservation within that region.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and it's just trying to get people in those communities to participate in this and kind of share the message with them.
Yeah.
are there lectures? Are there sort of things people could attend, tours, things like that?
Yeah, yeah, there are lectures, but there are also tours. So like a bus tour.
I kind of feel like you guys need a bus. I'm on this bus kick, as Crystal knows, because I think Extreme
no.
History should also have a bus, even if it's a short bus. I think buses for like historic tours and historic preservation would just elevate that whole field. And so I'm just going to speak out about it, keep speaking out about it until someone gives us a bus.
Nancy really
Ideally
wants a
an
bus.
electric bus.
Yeah.
I really do.
Yeah.
And then I want to paint the bus. So yeah, okay.
You know what we should do? We should collectively buy a bus here in Montana, and then you guys could use it for the road show.
Exactly.
We could use it for
somehow
tours.
The insurance
Yeah.
would be a nightmare on that, but
Yeah.
that would be super fun. Okay, we're going to take a quick station break on that. Okay. You're listening to The Dirt on the Past with co-hosts Crystal Alegria and Nancy Mahoney on KGVM Bozeman, or wherever you find your podcasts. We're speaking today with Peter Brown, the Montana State Historic Preservation Officer, about his job at the State Historic Preservation Office. All right, so how about we introduce sort of a different turn on the topic, and something just as important is that every state, ideally now, and I think they all do when they first set up the National Historic Preservation Office, every state has its own State Historic Preservation Office. And also a lot of the tribes, and I don't want to say all necessarily because I don't know, but a lot of the tribes have a tribal historic preservation office that ideally operates in a similar fashion to the state historic preservation offices. Even though they're not themselves states, they're sort of at a different level of government. But your guys are called SHPOs, they're called THPOs, they rhyme. So talk a little bit about how your office works with the tribal historic preservation offices.
Yeah, well, Montana has 7 tribal historic preservation offices, and they have one at each of the reservations in the state. And so they have a tribal historic preservation officer who's my counterpart, and then they have staff. And so their primary jurisdiction is within the boundaries of the reservation, and so that is anytime there's a federal undertaking within those boundaries, the federal agency has to consult with the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And we don't typically get involved unless the THPO wants us involved or engages with us in some way. But that's that is their work on the reservations. Federal agencies also consult with THPOs for things that are off the reservation when there's a likely significant site that would be affected by a federal project. SHPO is typically still the lead on those off-reservation projects, but the THPOs have a perspective that the agency and the SHPO don't. This is important to kind of fully understanding significance of some of these sites and what agency activities, what effect those activities could have on the integrity of those sites.
So they sort of act as consultants for ancestral, historic, or archaeological sites, and
Mm-hmm.
and a number of THPO officers may all consult on one project if they've had areas that overlap historically or even earlier than that.
Yep.
Okay, so kind of two ways in which, and one is, as I was thinking too, when you were saying you don't necessarily as a SHPO consult if there's something that's on reservation land, Indian land, but the way I sort of think I understand it is the SHPO probably has the best database, I think, of historic and archaeological sites. So is that shared with the THPO? Do they come to you sometimes for those records? Are records shared between those different agencies?
Yeah, we have a pretty complete, I guess we have the most complete database of known and documented cultural sites across Montana. And so we grant access to the THPOs. They can check out our database and GIS mapping. And that the information in that database, a lot of it's confidential because it is archaeological sites, and we don't want people showing up with metal detectors.
Yeah.
But the information in that database is a kind of baseline information. Before, say, MDT might want to do a road widening project or a reroute or something, their archaeologist is going to consult our database to see what is known about this area where we're working. Based on that, they'll do a survey or amend their project maybe to avoid known sites. But the THPOs also have access to that, and when there's work on the reservation, they can kind of go through the same process of they and the agency identifying any known sites, or maybe based on the topography, proximity to water, all that, there might be no known sites, but there's a high probability that there is a site in a given area, perhaps. So.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So there's, does every state have THPOs? Every state in the United States have THPOs?
Every state that has a reservation or multiple likely does have a THPO. Montana used to not have a THPO at every reservation, and we do now.
Mm-hmm.
And they're they have as much expertise as SHPO staff.
Yeah.
And so I would say that's pretty much standard for every state that has a reservation on it.
I think a lot of
Yeah.
that actually depends on the federal funding. From what I've heard about talking to THPOs, is there's not always the resources, depending on resources at a particular reservation. Say if it's especially small, or with a particular tribe that maybe doesn't even have land. So it can be challenging to fund an office and a staff. So I think going from our state not having one at every reservation to having one at every, they've been working towards that in certain ways. So yeah, I mean, ideally that would be the way it was structured. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Thanks. So, Pete, I want to talk a little bit also about some of the challenges that you face at SHPO in preserving and protecting historical resources within our state, because I'm sure there are many great opportunities, which we've talked a little bit about already, and all the work that you do to get the word out about what you're doing in the plan. But I'm sure there's challenges. So if you could speak to that a little bit, I'd be interested.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned the money issue earlier. That's the funds for brick and mortar projects, inventory of historic districts. Bozeman's going through a kind of a re-inventory of their historic districts to see
Yeah.
what's still there.
Right. Right.
Because it was, I think, first surveyed in maybe the 80s.
Yeah. It was
A lot's
surveyed
changed.
in 1984, and so between 1984 and now,
Hmm.
we've experienced a huge amount of growth, and then also just things have become historic that weren't historic in 1984. So yeah, they're doing a whole they're updating the inventory as much as they can. So
Yeah.
yeah, and extreme history's been a part of that a little bit as well.
Yeah. And so getting money to communities, Livingston's doing it also, and getting money to communities to do that, is you it's no one ever is given a check and say with the direction, go take care of this in a year. It's typically a piecemeal approach. Um, and so beyond the money, there's certainly just raising awareness of preservation and why it's important, getting people to recognize and value historic properties in their own communities that they may not be aware of. Um, from maybe a regulatory perspective, there's a lot of federal money flowing now. It's not just for preservation; it's for these, you know, uh, I guess fuels reduction projects. We call them large scale landscape projects.
Oh,
Fuels
okay.
reduction, that kind of thing.
So you mean like
Uh,
forest fires
yeah, yeah,
to
forest and
prevent
grass
forest
fires.
fires? Okay.
Hmm. So there are big things like that. The Great American Outdoors Act was enacted in the last few years, and that money's still active. And then the infrastructure law, which has put money into all kinds of undertakings, federal undertakings. And so agency staff and SHPO staff and THPO staff kind of spread thin
Mm.
these days. We actually were able to hire an additional staff person a couple years ago to keep up with our compliance workload.
So you have to review all that, and that's where
Right.
that work comes in for SHPO. Okay.
Or is it that
Okay.
you actually have to have staff go out or maybe somebody else is hired to do the surveys when you're talking about these fuel reduction acts in these big landscapes. So they have to go out and first see what historic or archaeological resources are going to be impacted
Hmm.
by removing trees from the forest. And
Okay.
so all that,
Right.
then you have to oversee who's doing that, how that's done, and they have to report to SHPO.
Yeah, yeah. And all that has to occur. Well, it should be occurring before crews show up. But
Right.
it sounds like simple work on the surface. Person goes out in the woods with a chainsaw and starts cutting things down. But there's so much staging involved in dragging trees and heavy equipment. And you can do an archaeological survey and do your best effort, but you won't necessarily see everything. And I think it's inevitable that some things may get overlooked just because of the scale of these projects. And then I think another challenge is the certainly the wildfires when they do occur, but also floods. And if you consider that for thousands of years people have lived near water, look what's happening with our rivers. There a lot of soils getting moved out in these flood events or deposited. So archaeological sites, whether they're known or unknown, are definitely being impacted by some of these large scale national natural disasters.
Yeah. 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 It's flood season here in Montana. So
We've been having a lot of rain this
yeah.
year.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, Pete, I wanted to ask, just for any listeners out there, sort of what the ways in which an individual member of the public is most likely to engage with the SHPO. And I'm thinking of, like, because we get calls sometimes at the university and places, someone has found a site, or they think they found a site, or they found an artifact. What do they do? What should they do? And that's one part of the question. And I'm thinking also of the person who might think, "Ooh, we have a wonderful historic structure in our community, and I'd like to nominate it for the National Register." So, talk a little bit about, in those two cases, how individuals might need to, or they should think about contacting the SHPO, and what the SHPO office would do to work with that person.
Yeah. So if it's archaeology, we get calls periodically, like I own X number of acres and I have, rock art on my site, or I have some stone circles on my site. People can reach out to us, and we can't necessarily get to all these sites to document them, although we would love to. That's the most fun we have in our work here, is getting out and seeing things firsthand. But we can give people forms that they could use to document the location of these sites on their property, take some photos, submit them to us with kind of the legal location, and we could plug them into our database. And there that doesn't necessarily get that site protected. If it's private property, again, someone could buy that property 10 years from now and decide they're going to dynamite that rock face and put a house up. Who knows? But it's good to have the record, and we're happy to take that kind of information. With buildings, oftentimes people want to nominate their historic house or business to the National Register. So we have a National Register coordinator, John Boughton, who works with those people to nominate their property to the register. And then, with buildings, people often call us up and ask if there's funding to help fix their building, or they have some, historic architecture. A lot of the methods for construction have been not in use for a long time. So if you have a log building and it needs, sill logs rotten, you may not know how to go about fixing it yourself, or who to call to get someone to come out and fix it. And so we're kind of a clearinghouse for best practices for building treatments also. And when we don't have the answer, chances are we know someone who could provide that answer. So we can do a little bit of research for people, or put them in touch with someone who has those answers.
That's great.
Yeah, very helpful. So what are maybe one or two favorite projects that the SHPO has worked on, or initiatives that they've worked on that you really enjoyed and felt was meaningful?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll brag a little bit about one that we're doing. It's actually starting. It's our first time through it. It's our youth archaeological survey program.
Oh, fun. Awesome.
Nice.
And we're kicking that off. And it's a partnership with the Montana Discovery Foundation and Montana DNRC. And so what we are doing is kind of taking advantage of an existing program that the Discovery Foundation has in collaboration with the Forest Service, where they go out on Forest Service land. They do like stream monitoring, soil quality, vegetation surveys, that kind of stuff. And they're teaching, the staff teach these high school students how to do the basic work, and then they do a report at the end. So that's a program that's been around for about 20 years, and we have approached them to introduce an archaeological component, or an archaeology component to that. And so the Forest Service kind of has their own archaeology staff. They're surveying their own property, but Montana DNRC, they also have an archaeologist, but they have so much land that's unsurveyed. We're getting high school students to go out with Laura Marsh from the Historical Society. She's an archaeologist, and Patrick Rennie, he's DNRC's archaeologist. And Laura and Patrick are going to teach these high school students how to do archaeological survey, and they're going to just walk, I don't know how many acres of DNRC land. It'll be exciting for them because there are some known stone circles up there, and they're pretty highly likely to find some cool stuff in their survey. And then so those students, this is like a 6-week kind of class, and they'll write a report on it that we will have then as part of our database. Now I want to point out that the survey is not them excavating these sites. It's looking for things that are evident on the surface.
Kind of just walking the
they
ground.
may do some test pits just to get a sense of if are there any artifacts, is there any like charcoal we could use to carbon date to determine like how old that such and such a layer of soil is. But this is not what people think of archaeology as being, where you have these big holes in the ground, you're pulling out jawbones and bullets and cannonballs.
Right. What a great opportunity for high school students. I mean, I would have loved something like that.
I would have loved something, but I'm glad to hear they're going to a place where they're likely to find some things, because nothing would squash that interest right out of somebody faster than 6 weeks of finding nothing. And then writing a report about it. That would be brilliant.
Yeah, but it's good also, to introduce them to that idea of survey if they do want to go into archaeology, because of course that's what archaeology mainly is these days, is not as much the excavation aspect of it, but more that walking the ground and just seeing what is there and documenting that and not doing excavation. And so I think it gives them a realistic viewpoint of what their future could be as an archaeologist if they want to be a field archaeologist. So I love that. And you guys have been doing a lot of other great, or providing a lot of other great opportunities for interns and things like that as well, or connecting students with internships. There's an amazing amount of internships for college students this year in the fields of archaeology and history. And I know that a lot of that came through your office.
Yeah, we actually have people, I never think of state agencies as places people donate money, but people donate money to our office, and we've been trying to cultivate donors so that we can have paid internships. And
nice.
I should give a plug to another project and another person here. Kate Hampton has done research for 16 years, I think, at this 15 16 years at this point on Black history in Montana, and she has hosted numerous interns.
It's great.
And that effort kind of culminated in a documentary that aired on Montana PBS in February. I think it's still available online. It's called Hidden Places, Hidden Stories, and it's about Montana's Black history and some of the places that are associated with those people.
It was a great documentary.
Yeah, we've had
a
lot of interns working on that, assisting Kate in that effort.
Yeah. So many good things coming out of your office right now, and we'll talk more about those in future episodes too. We're excited to be talking about some of those initiatives. But so many great opportunities for students. And I think that's just wonderful. And I love those internship opportunities. But that high school, that's just so exciting to me.
That's fantastic. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so that it ties back to the plan and our kind of need to diversify the people who are interested in preservation and approaching kids. Planting these seeds now is pretty important.
That's really, really important. Yeah. And give them, the job opportunities in this field are really wonderful right now as well. Because there's a lot of jobs in state government with history, historic preservation, archaeology, but also in federal government as well. So I think that's wonderful to kind of show them the way to some of those jobs. But one other question I had for you, Pete, is that, here in Bozeman anyway, and really throughout Montana, there's been so much growth in our urban centers, in our cities and our towns, and a lot of development happening. And of course, development and historic preservation can go wonderfully together, but sometimes they don't often mix. So can you talk a little bit about, continuing to, I guess, a little bit to talk about some of the challenges, but can you talk about how you and your office ensure the long-term sustainability of historic sites and cultural heritage within our state of Montana?
Well, we operate with more, in the private sector, we have more carrots than sticks. We don't have a stick for the private sector.
Right, right.
Some people are really glad we don't. Some people wish we had a huge stick. But we have no stick. So carrots are what we use. And for commercial buildings, the best carrot, I guess, there are a couple things out there actually. There's the federal rehab tax credit program, which incentivizes redevelopment of kind of languishing historic income producing properties that need substantial rehabilitation. And so the best example I can point to is in Bozeman on Montana Avenue and Minnesota Avenue, kind of straddling the railroad tracks there.
In Billings, you mean? Billings?
Billings, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
You said Bozeman, but
yeah, sorry, Billings. There have been so many tax credit projects there. And the key is buildings that need lots and lots of work. Because you have to pass what they call a substantial rehab test, which is based on how much your project will cost you. And I won't go into the minutia of that. People can look it up, but that's a harder thing. It's harder to pass that test and qualify for those tax credits in Bozeman because Bozeman's kind of building stock is actually pretty well maintained and doesn't need that substantial rehabilitation.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of places that are that way. I think Helena is kind of that way, where they don't have caving in roofs or caving in walls.
Yeah.
But Butte,
but that
Butte's
so the tax
be,
credit program.
Yeah, probably Butte.
Butte, yeah, for sure,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. That's a really good carrot too. That
Mm-hmm.
program is really.
Let's go buy a building, Crystal.
Yeah, there we go.
Think about it.
That'll be fun.
And a building.
I was just going to say,
we need a big garage.
I'd much rather like the building than the bus.
Really? Okay. I see where we're going now. All right, forget the bus. Let's just get a building.
Well, the other thing that I wish we could lay claim to, it's not our program, but the Montana Department of Commerce has a historic preservation grant program, and it's pretty massive.
Yeah.
And it's new. They've had 2 grant cycles. It operates on the state biennium. So people submit their applications in even number years, and they Department of Commerce staff and SHPO staff and State Tourism Board review those applications and score them, and then we make recommendations to the legislature, who then, when they're in session, they will identify who gets these grants. But I mean, those projects are pretty good sized projects. They're always very costly projects.
Is it mostly brick and mortar projects?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Brick and mortar projects.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And it's a historic preservation grant, so it's not just like anyone with a building that's kind of tied to tourism. It's got to be a historic property, not necessarily listed in the National Register, but so I think that right there, putting people in touch with that program, and some people have gotten that money and they've coupled their project with tax credits. And that's kind of leveled the playing field on some of these more costly preservation projects.
Yeah, those are both really good carrots. And, there's so much value in a historic building, so that adaptive reuse is huge,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Bozeman has really capitalized on that on our Main Street and really put their dollars into those adaptive reuse projects, and our economy in Bozeman is booming. Our downtown
Well,
Main
the
Street.
U.S. Bank, I'm
Yeah.
wondering if that project was in part funded by this grant, because they're pulling off the 1960s facade, or 1970s,
1971,
1971 facade, and which was all stucco and modern, and underneath is the brick and these arches and beautiful windows, and we're all so excited to see that emerging. But this is a massive multi-year project. Yeah. But it's really restoring a huge viewscape to our downtown. you know?
Yeah. So if they
Amazing.
didn't use it, they should have.
I know. I better talk to those people. Okay, so just sort of one final question for you, Peter, and then we'll let you off the hook, out of the hot seat. And this is a tough one. I'm asking for a very eloquent response to why. What do you think is the most important relevance today to preserving Montana's cultural heritage? Why is it important today? This is a question we ask really all of the people that we interview on our things, and we ask ourselves it all the time. So I'm interested in for you. People might say, why aren't we putting money into these other things? Why are we putting it into heritage? Why care so much? What's the value today?
Yeah. Well, I think our historic downtowns and our historically open landscapes are why people value Montana. And to kind of tarnish those or remove them or lessen them from what they have been historically just kind of removes a key asset that Montana has. I think if you want to put that in dollars and cents, our tourism industry is based on those two things. Kind of unfettered open space. People want to see, if they can, they want to see a few things when they come to Montana. They want to see grizzly bears, and I bet they want to see someone riding on a horse who's not part of a trail tour or something. A guy in a cowboy hat or something, on a horse, because that's how he works. He's a rancher. They want to see that. They want to have that genuine experience. And historic downtowns, they have some commonalities with other historic downtowns in other parts of the world, but every historic downtown is unique unto itself. And so people want to come and see Main Street and get away from maybe the hotel off the bypass or whatever, the highway, and see something genuine, and it is different from the place where they come from.
Right. They can get away from the Target and the Walmart and the Bucks stores.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that answer, Pete. And we're running out of time for this episode, and we just want to thank you so incredibly much for taking the time to talk to us today and explain this office that maybe some folks didn't know that much about and could use as a resource. So let's just finish up by asking you, where can people find out more information about Montana's State Historic Preservation Office, as well as its current projects?
Yeah, I think simply Googling Montana SHPO is the quickest way to find us. It'll get you right to our website and probably get you to any recent press on things that we've done.
Great, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, it was such a joy to talk with you today, Pete. So thank you so much for sitting down to take time to talk about historic preservation with us, but not just historic preservation, really cultural heritage in general. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great.
Wonderful.
All right. Thanks, Pete. And thanks to all our listeners out there for joining us today. If you love this podcast, please tell a friend and make sure to subscribe so it shows up in your podcast feed each week, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Thanks for listening today, and we hope you can join us again to find out more about
The Dirt on the Past. And thank you again to the Montana SHPO for sponsoring this episode. And a big thanks to our editors, Drake Pennell and Sierra Thomas. And thanks to Lawson Alegria for mixing the music, and to Steve Durbin at KGVM and John Chadwell for help getting the podcast out in the world.